Good morning, folks. Welcome back to another beautiful Nebraska morning. The number one question we get out here on the farm when people come out, and even from people online, is how do we keep the garden weed free? And you can see there's not a lot of weeds out here in our garden. There are weeds, believe it or not. We are not absolutely weed free, but it appears that we are. Now, I really enjoy gardening, and I'm really proud of my garden, and I like to keep it, the weeds down in my garden. So, one, it's not such a daunting task if I do need to take care of some weeds. There's really not a lot out here to take care of. And I'll tell you the secret to all of this. So, when we're talking weeds, we need to talk about what's called a seed bank. And when we talk about the seed bank, we're referring to the available weed seeds in the garden that will sprout. And what you want to do is decrease the size of that seed bank. So the seed bank is the only bank that you can do as many withdrawals as you want and never make any deposits. Great concept, right? So let's talk a little bit about how that works. So like we said, there's lots and lots of weed seeds already in your soil. You're never going to overdraw that bank account. But they come in from birds, they come in from the wind, all kinds of different things, or just neglect to your garden. If you've got a bunch of weeds out in your garden and you neglect them and they grow and they mature enough to go to seed, you're going to have a deposit in your seed bank, and you don't want any deposits if you can get by with that. Now, there's an old saying in the garden world: 1 year of ease equals 10 years of weeds. And that's about the case, because weed seeds last a long time. They're very hardy crops, and their whole goal is to survive and duplicate themselves. So you got to stay on top of it. Now, you see lots of people on the internet that go to great lengths to not have or limit the weeds in their garden. I've seen gardens with weed barrier cloth over the whole garden. And then they go through and they take like a propane torch and they burn holes where they want to plant their plants. That's a lot of expense to go to, and at that point you're pretty much paying to have a garden. You might as well buy your vegetables downtown. Now, those that have the funds to do that, great. They still know where their food's coming from, and that's a good thing. But you don't have to go to all that expense. It can be a lot cheaper than buying all that stuff. So here's some tips, folks, to keep the weeds down in your garden. Tip number one: don't water your weeds. And you have to water your garden, right? But like we're doing here, we have drip hoses that they're not underground. They're just under the mulch that we put in the rows. And that means we're not watering out here in the middles. Now, if we don't get regular rains, the middles out here will dry up, which is not conducive to weed germination. And that's what you want. The only place you want to have to deal with weeds is right along your row. So that's the only place you should water. If you're watering with a big sprinkler, like for just total coverage of your garden, you're watering all those weeds as well. Now, there is a time and place for a sprinkler. If I want to make a huge withdrawal from my seed bank and say my garden either is not in yet or we've just taken out in the fall, we're starting to wind things down. Sometimes I'll put a big sprinkler out here and sprinkle all of this, the whole ground, and I'll let every weed that can germinate. And then I'll come through it with the walk behind tiller, and we'll till all those in, using them as a green manure even. But they haven't gone to seed, so they're not going to regrow. But you're sprouting as many seeds as you can. So that's about the only time that I would water with a sprinkler. Now recently we've got lots and lots of rain. About once a week we've got a torrential rain. If you remember from our garden tour, I loosened all this soil in the middles up. Well, then we got another big rain and it's starting to seal up again. And I'll show you later on what we do for that. Now, tip number 2 is mulch. Last year we did not have the benefit of mulch because we hadn't lived here for a year and had a compost pile which we could utilize later on. This year we did. You can see in the rows we composted all of our rows, put in a mulch layer over the top once we established our rows after we run our subsoiler through. And then what we did was, after we ran the subsoiler, we laid our irrigation in the little furrow, and then we covered the whole furrow with mulch. And it does an unbelievable job of keeping weeds from germinating. It's been so much nicer this year, because anytime the soil's covered, it's not getting sunlight, and it insulates it, and you don't get a lot of seed growth or weed growth. We have had a few weeds here and there. That's going to happen, but just 1 or 2 here and there is better than weeds all through your row. Like last year, I had to weed this garden row by row last year because it was just too much to do in one time out here in the garden like I do now. I can come out in the morning every probably 3 days and weed this whole garden in just one go round. But the mulch really helps with your weeds. So I highly recommend using mulch. It composts down and improves your soil as well. Like right here in this garden, these rows are now going to always be in this same location because of our fence posts down there. We drive our tractor right through those fence posts. So every 8 feet we put a row. And that brings us to our next tip. Tip number 3 is give yourself some room to operate. We've last year had our rows were a lot closer. They were almost like 30 inches apart or so. But we were doing a test garden and we wanted to try a lot of different plants here in the garden, so we needed the space. Now we've settled on our permanent row configuration, which, like I said, is the 8 feet. So all of these rows are 8 feet apart with the exception of the end rows, which are only 4 feet from the fence. So on the end rows I put smaller crops which don't get out into the row so bad. Now on this side we got some zucchini squash, and I normally buy the bush type squash, but our yellow squash is more of a viney type and it's getting out into the row. But when you leave yourself plenty of room in the row, if you start getting really bad weed pressure here in the walk path, you can just bring out your rototiller, if you have one, your walk behind, and just go up and down these roads and break those up. And then you're only having to deal with the actual rows themselves. Now, if you don't have a rototiller, there is another option, and I'll show you what that is. This, my friends, is called a wheel hoe. It's got handles on it, and right now I have the kind of the ripper shanks on it, little tiny ripper shanks. But they make lots of different attachments for these wheel hoes. So I have some plow attachments, I have a furrowing attachment, I got some weed sweeps, just a little rake, and then a wider cultivator, kind of just use it to break up the soil. I even got the original wrench that comes with these wheel hoes. Now the story behind this wheel hoe has some history. This wheel hoe was actually purchased by my grandfather in 1931. They always had a huge garden out on the dairy, and they purchased this to help keep things tilled up in the garden. Now, my uncle ended up with it, and he lived up in the mountains near Yosemite out in California, and they had a forest fire come through their place. Their house was saved, thankfully, thanks to the brave men and women of the Cal Fire Service. But I was poking around out in his yard one day, after the fire, and I found this little metal frame, and I knew exactly what it was when I found it. And it was all burned up and rusty. There was no wooden handles on it. There wasn't even a wheel on it. There was no attachments on it. All it was this green frame down here. So I drug it out of the ash pile and took it up to my uncle's house, and he said, "You know what that is?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I do." So he proceeded to tell me the story. So he gifted it to me, and he said he had the other parts for it somewhere, and he would look around for them. So I took that home, and I cleaned it all up. We soaked it in vinegar, got all the rust off of it. I made the wheel for it, and I made the handles for it. Now, the handles originally came with this pistol grip style here, really nice, but you can no longer get those. It's just the curved style now. Now, my mom contacted me this morning early and actually said my aunt and uncle had to evacuate because they have another fire coming through this year. So they've had to go down to their daughter's house. So please keep them in your thoughts and prayers, and hopefully they'll be have a house to go home to when they go back. Now, this wheel hoe was called a Planet Junior, P-L-A-N-E-T, just like the Earth. And it's stamped right into that frame, so I could figure out what it was. Now, I'm assuming the company's name was Planet, and this was like a junior model of their wheel hoe. So when you look up Planet Junior, now it will direct you to the Haas Tools website. So what I'm thinking happened is maybe Haas Tools bought out the rights to the Planet Junior or the other wheel hoes, and now they provide these wheel hoes through their company, Haas Tools. You can get this exact frame and still buy this, and you can still buy parts for this. However, those pistol grip handles that I showed you, they either show out of stock or you can't get them anymore. I actually manufactured these from some oak cabinet wood and scaled them from the pictures I saw on the website and was able to make these, so it's original. So, but yeah, you can still get all these tools for it, all the parts for it, and you can even get different tools for it. They have like an oscillating hoe attachment that's really wide that I would like to get, but I found the original wrench online and purchased that. My uncle called me back a couple weeks later. He had found a lot of the tools. I had already made some tools and got some tools from a friend of mine. His dad had an old wheel hoe that had disappeared. He thinks somebody stole it, but he still had a couple of the attachments, and then I adapted them to work on this Planet Junior wheel hoe. Now, if you look on the Haas Tools website, they have different versions of this wheel hoe. They have a double wheel version, and they even have a kit to turn the one I have into a double wheel version. So you can run it down the row for little crops that are just coming up or just planted. You can like cultivate down either side without running over the plants in the row. Now, they make another wheel hoe that's called a high arch, and it's got a big arch in the middle with wheel on either side that you can actually run down a corn row and cultivate on either side of the corn before it gets too tall to do so. So it's pretty cool, and I'll show you a little bit what I use this for out in our garden right now. So I believe we're on tip number 4, and that's getting the right tools or making the right tools for the job. Now, this is one of my go-to tools for weeding out in the garden. Now, I made this myself. What you do is you go down to the hardware store or whatever and buy you a hoe, and then what I did is I took my 4.5-inch grinder and I cut the outsides off of the hoe and made it very narrow, and I use this for weeding in the garden. It's got a real nice long handle where I'm not bending over, causing a lot of stress to my back, and it works fantastic. I put the little notch in there so it'll grab the weed roots and jerk them right up out of the ground. Now, if you want to make one of these for yourself and you don't have a 4.5-inch grinder, find a friend that does. Or you could even use a hacksaw. As long as it's not real crazy hard tool steel, you could cut that with a hacksaw and make your own little digger hoe. Now, it works fantastic for getting around the plants you can get right up close to that plant and drag a weed right out of the ground next to the plant. So it works really well, and I highly recommend making one of these hoes. So tip number 5, hoe your weeds when they are tiny. If you wait until they get a real nice established root system and they get taller, they're much, much harder to get up out of the ground. You try to pull them and you can't hardly get them up out of the ground. So let me show you the size of weeds that I have when I come out and hoe. Look at the size of that. That is much easier to hoe out of the ground than a big old established weed. These actually leftovers from a day and a half ago. I probably missed these because they were a bit smaller. But at that size, you can't even hardly see them out here in the garden. And like I said, do yourself a favor, hoe them at that point, and it's really effortless. You just fly right down the row, and it really takes no effort whatsoever to pop those little weeds out of the ground. Tip number 6 is don't kill yourself trying to get it done. If the work out in the garden becomes too intense, it's hard to get started doing it. It's hard to get the motivation to come out into the garden, and it just becomes a chore that you just don't want to do. So if you've let your weeds go a little too long, like a week or something like that, and you haven't been out in the garden, what you need to do is to start row by row weeding. So instead of like I'm able to do right now, just come out every other day or every 3 days and just do a quick run through of the garden. Takes maybe 45 minutes to do this whole garden. You need to go row by row. So pick a row, do a row a day. So you're still around the 20-30 minute mark if your weeds got away from you, and do 1 row every day. Do it in the morning when it's nice and cool. Put you some music out here on your Bluetooth radio and just do a nice stroll through the garden. It's very therapeutic, and I love being out here this time of day. And then after a week or 2, you'll be caught back up on your weeds, and then you can go back to, just running through every few days. So don't make it a job that you just absolutely hate doing. And that's why I encourage you to stay on top of it. If you stay on top of this, it's really not a lot of effort at all, folks, to keep a nice weed-free garden. Now, tip number 7, if you've weeded through your garden, try not to step on those weeds after you've dug them up out of the ground. A lot of times that will plant them right back into the ground, and then your work was for nothing. I try to go backwards when I'm weeding my row, so I'm not stepping on those plants. And when I dig them out, I work the root ball on that weed pretty well, so there's no dirt left on it. And I always try to weed, like I said, early in the morning, so when the sun comes up during the day, that weed's laying out on top of the ground, and it will dry up and not re-root into the ground. So try not to step on your weeds after you dig them up. It'll leave them up nice, knock the dirt off real nice to where the sun will dry them out, kill them. Now, tip number 8 is be proactive. If you're out here harvesting in your garden, which means you're going down the actual rows, and you see a weed down by the base of the plant, grab it, pull it out real quick. It's not that big a deal. You're already there doing something else, and it saves you lots of time later if you can be proactive and do that as you go through the garden. Now, tip number 8, weed spray or chemicals have no business being inside your interior garden space. However, on the perimeter of my garden, along the fences, I will do weed spray. And I do that to keep the weeds out of the fence where I can't hoe and I can't mow. So every now and then, on a really calm day, you don't want any wind drift, I spray around my edges. So now when I mow, I think we're going to mow later this afternoon, I can mow right up next to that fence, and then all that's gone, and I don't have weeds in my fence. So, tip number 9 is stay on top of things, obviously. So with our rains we've been getting, all this dirt sealed over, And if you can imagine, with all that moisture, we're going to start getting some weed pressure out here in the middles. Now, to get a jump on that, I could either bring my rototiller out here and run down the rows real quick, or I'll show you what I can do with our handy dandy wheel hoe. Now that was real time. I didn't speed that up at all. You can see it doesn't take very long to do those middles. I'll come back and do the rest of this in a little bit after we're done making this video. Now, wouldn't you rather have a garden that looks like this than a garden full of weeds? Now, wheel hoes are for maintenance. You're not going to take one of these things and till up a garden that's already full of weeds. It'll get hung up on all the roots and just wouldn't be effective at all, and it would turn into a real headache. So you need to stay on top. Now, there's two reasons that I do this after a real good rain. Is one, I don't want the soil to crust over like this and get really hard, because then it becomes harder to hoe weeds. It's much easier to hoe weeds in loose soil. Now, the other reason I do this, any weeds that we're going to start germinating here in the middle because of all that moisture, this ground will now dry out and there won't be as much available moisture for those weeds to germinate. And chances are that they won't. So that's why we do that. Again, that goes back to leaving yourself plenty of room to do that. All right, folks, that'll be about the end of this video. So I hope you've picked up some helpful hints to keep your garden looking good during the summer. It's really a rewarding thing to have a nice garden and have people compliment you on the shape of your garden and how it looks. So I really enjoy keeping my garden clean, and I just do it that way because that's the way Dad would have did it, and that's the way Grandma would have did it. So until next time, stay safe, stay healthy. We love you guys. Come back and see us here on Markelly Farm. We'll be doing a video coming up, another garden tour. So we'll see you then.